Everyone, and thank you for joining the first in a three-part webinar series, Understanding and Managing Cyber Risks. To improve an organization's security intelligence, everyone needs to have a better understanding of where the risks are and what can be done to eliminate potential threats. Without solid security education and training, everyone within the organization puts their company in jeopardy of a data breach and its potential fallout, which includes costly fines and often a reputation hit. My name is Dottie Schindlinger. I'm Diligent's Vice President and Governance Technology Evangelist. I'm very excited to be partnering with Jeff Welgan from CyberVista on this webinar series. Over the course of the series, you'll learn about the threats, vulnerabilities, and impacts of cyber risks and the measures you can take to protect your organization. In the first session today, we'll be discussing the multiple threats organizations face specific to each industry, the ways organizations can be attacked, why certain organizations are particularly susceptible to cyber risk threats, and how to defend against the growing number of cyber threats. But before we get started, I'd like to talk about the work Diligent and CyberVista do, as well as provide a little bit of background about Jeff and myself. One very quick word about Diligent. For participants joining us who might not be familiar with what we do, we've been providing board portal technology for the last 16 years or so. We have offices worldwide in 12 different locations, and we've helped over 4,700 companies and 140,000 board members worldwide in making the transition to digital communication and collaboration solutions. At Diligent, I provide thought leadership on related topics through digital and print publications, conference presentations, workshops for board members and executives globally. Some background on my experience, I'm actually just a recent addition to the Diligent team. I was a founding member of a company called BoardEffect, which is also a board management software platform, and we're delighted now to be part of the Diligent Corporation family of brands. Prior to that, I spent about 15 years working in governance-related roles, including a variety of roles, board liaison, board member, senior executive, consultant, trainer, to public, private, and nonprofit boards. I'm also joined today by Jeff Welgan. He's the head of executive training programs at CyberVista. CyberVista is a cybersecurity training and workforce development company, and Jeff heads up the board and executive training programs, providing cyber literacy training for directors and executives. The program centers around managing and governing cyber risk as well as an enterprise risk issue, which I think is really important. We're going to be talking a lot about that today. Jeff's cyber expertise is rooted in all source, strategic analysis of cyber threat actors, as well as nation-state cyber capabilities and doctrines. Prior to joining the team at CyberVista, he led and managed a cyber threat intelligence capability at Booz Allen Hamilton, focusing primarily on specialized cyber threat studies for commercial and government clients. He also served in the U.S. Navy, both as an intelligence specialist and a search and rescue swimmer. As an intelligence specialist, he managed and led a team of intelligence personnel through 2 deployments in support of Operations Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, and Noble Eagle. So with that, I'm going to hand over the controls to Jeff and ask him to kick off today's presentation. And by the way, just a little bit of housekeeping. As we go through this presentation, we would very much like to have you participate in the conversation. And so you'll notice on the GoToWebinar control panel that there are a couple of buttons that you can use to get our attention. One is a button that allows you to submit a question. You can type the question directly into the question box. We'll be able to see those come across, and we will be taking the questions in turn, and I'll pose the questions to Jeff as we go through the presentation. Another way that you can get our attention, especially if you're having any technical difficulties, is just to send us a chat message. I'll see that flash across my screen, and I can sort of get back to you privately and help you with anything that's happening. And then finally, you also have the opportunity to raise your hand. So if you'd like to raise your hand, you can do that, and we can then address your question and try to get you whatever assistance you need. Just to mention, there are some handouts attached to the GoToWebinar control panel. I noticed that there were a little bit of difficulty with some of the handouts. We're going to be making sure that those are working correctly. So if you're trying to download the handouts and you're having difficulty, we know that those need to be updated, so we will make sure to do that, and we'll make sure to provide the handouts to you after the fact. So without further ado, Jeff, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Dottie, and thank you to Diligent for hosting me for this 3-part webinar series. I'd actually like to get started off by going over a couple of statistics with you guys from the most recent NACD survey. And so I'm going to write some things down here. 59%, 56%, and 12%. According to the most recent survey, 59% of board of directors find it challenging to manage cyber and manage and oversee cyber risk. 56% of directors feel that directors do not get enough director education in their boards. And then lastly, only 12% of boardrooms and directors have participated over the past year in a test of their organization's cyber response plans. So why is cyber risk such a challenge for directors and senior executives? Well, it's a challenge in part because it's a challenge because innovation and technology is evolving at such a rapid pace that it's difficult to keep up with all of the issues and opportunities when it comes to technology and innovation. But it's also a big challenge because it's being communicated to you the wrong way. So I want you to think about, through this webinar series, I want you to think about cybersecurity like the brakes on a car. Most people think that the brakes are there to actually slow you down. That's also the common perception when it comes to cybersecurity, that it's a hindrance to organizations, it slows the organization down because they have to go through all these processes. But the reality is that the brakes on a car were actually designed to make you go faster. So CyberVista's training programs really empower you to be comfortable behind the wheel of that car. We want to empower you to drive your organizations down the road of success as fast and as safe as possible. And we coach you to recognize what threats and obstacles are along that path, and then hone your skills so that you become the best driver possible for your organization. At the end of all of our programs, you will recognize corners ahead, learn when to apply those brakes, and then accelerate out of those curves with professional precision. So aside from grand visions of becoming a Formula One race car driver, there are 3 other things that I want you to take away from this webinar series. So I'm going to write a couple more things down. The first thing is enterprise risk. Cyber is no longer just an IT issue. It's an enterprise-wide issue, and therefore it should be managed as such. The second big takeaway that I want you to take away from this series is that cyber, at the end of the day, is a people problem. People are at the core of everything cyber, whether that is a technology solution, the policies and procedures, and the controls that you put in place at your organizations, or even the adversaries. It all comes down to people. And then the last thing I want you to take away is that at the end of the day, cyber risk is both measurable and manageable. So you can actually measure and track cyber risk across time. And because you can measure it and track it, then you can also start to put things in place to manage those risks. And that's what we're doing here today with this webinar. Because cyber risk is an enterprise risk issue, it actually is an influencer to all of your other traditional risk categories, whether that's a financial risk, an operational risk, compliance, strategic, or physical risk. It acts as an influencer to all of those. So what is cyber risk? Well, cyber risk, at the end of the day, is a product of 3 coefficients. Cyber risk equals your threats times your vulnerabilities times impacts. And that's what we're going to focus on with this webinar series. Today, we're going to cover threats. On the 9th, if you join us on the 9th, we're going to talk about vulnerabilities. We'll talk about things like attack surface. We'll talk about the people problem a little bit more. And we'll talk about third-party risks. And then lastly, impacts. On the 16th, if you join us for the last of the 3-part series, you'll hear about what happens when threats and vulnerabilities come together and they coalesce to create some sort of impact. You'll also learn some techniques and tools to help manage that risk. So by the end of the entire series, you'll have a good handle on what comprises cyber risk, and then you'll be able to use those tools and techniques to the techniques you have at your disposal to manage and dial that risk accordingly based on the thresholds you have and set at your organizations. So with that, we'll switch back over to the slides for a few, and we'll dive right in. Okay, so to sum up cyber risk, think of it this way. The threats are essentially the who and the why. It's all of your external factors. It's basically the thief looking for his new victim. Your vulnerabilities are all the controllable aspects of your business. They are the locked or sometimes unlocked doors and windows at your organization. And impacts are the result when threats and vulnerabilities come together. It's when the unlocked door is opened by the bad guy and he walks in. To aid leadership, we have developed a cyber governance framework. Our framework and training program is divided into 3 main sections, and you can see them here on this slide. Prepare, monitor, and react. Our Prepare unit focuses squarely on understanding cyber risk and setting leadership up for success. And this is the focus of our series. The Monitor unit centers on monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of any controls implemented across people, process, technology, and environment. We stress the importance of using a scorecard to measure cyber risk, as well as key policies that help reduce your cyber risk profile. And then lastly, our React unit focuses on leadership's role during a major cyber incident. It's designed around managing enterprise risk during a crisis so that the organization can focus on the end game without too much disruption to its strategic goals or vision. And as a part of this unit, we also integrate a really great cyber breach simulation into our live training programs. So let's go ahead and get started here. Today we're going to be talking about threats, and I'd like to start off with a poll. So we'll open up polling here. The first question I want to present to you guys is, on average, how many days does it take to discover a malicious attack has occurred? All right, we'll close the poll, and we'll show the results. Okay, so the correct answer to that is 256 days. Answer is D. So we'll slide right back into the next question here. Okay, on average, how many days does it take to resolve a malicious attack after it's been discovered? So it's already been discovered. Now we're trying to resolve those. So we'll open that up. Okay, close it. Looks like 35% of you got it right with 82 days. So if you look at that, if the average time is to discover that a malicious attack is 229 days, or 256 days, and then it takes an additional 82 days to contain that attack, that's a total dwell time of 311 days. So in other words, if someone breaks into your organization on January 1st, that issue won't be resolved until November 7th. So if a criminal was in your office building for that long, how much damage do you think they would cause? It's crazy to think about it. All right, so go to the next slide here. Okay, at the end of the day, every company is essentially a technology company. Each organization moves and stores data because it's a necessity for today's business functions and operations. But cyber is different. It overlaps all other risk areas, and it's often a blind spot in risk scorecards and dashboards. It's also very ubiquitous, and it touches every employee, customer, supplier, etc. But it's also different because it's digital. Every copy of your digital data is an original copy. It can be lost or stolen, or you wouldn't even necessarily know it. It's not the same as when your wallet or purse is stolen from you. If either of those go missing, that is something you would clearly recognize in a short amount of time. Digital is different. Remember that data is both an asset and a liability to your organizations. You need to determine how you can maximize your business opportunities while also reducing your risks. It's an asset because it gives you business intelligence, customer intimacy, just-in-time supply chain, etc., a whole host of data sets. But it's also a liability because it's of the costs associated with storing and protecting that data. And in the event of a loss, recovery, fines, penalties, brand equity, future business, and reputation are all big liabilities for you. So what you want to do is to encourage life cycle management. You can't lose what you don't have. Data and information also has inherent value to you, but also to threat actors. Bad and unintended things can happen to your data. And on the screen here, what you see are some of those things. Confidentiality, for example. This is when data is stolen or exposed or used for some sort of unintended purpose. The integrity can also be affected. This is when data becomes corrupted or no longer functional or trustworthy. And then lastly, the availability is something that can also happen to your data. This is when it's not accessible, whether it's destroyed, denied from you, or held hostage. If you can't access it, operations are impacted from it. And you're seeing a lot of this over the last year, couple of years, especially with ransomware. It's affecting your availability.
Hey, Jeff, this is Dottie chiming in for just a moment. I wondered if you don't mind taking a question at this point in time.
Sure.
Great. So, we have a couple of questions coming in. Before I ask the question, though, I want to just make a general announcement for those that have just joined the webinar. I want to let everybody know that we've identified that there's an issue with the handouts that were attached to the webinar, to the GoToWebinar control panel. So what we will be doing is sending out those handouts as part of a follow-up email. So just to let everybody know, we will make sure that you get the handouts. We know that the download is not working properly right now, so just to let everybody know that. But the question I wanted to ask, Jeff, a couple of people have chimed in and asked a couple of questions, and going back to that previous slide, thinking about the different kinds of data that can be potentially vulnerable. I mean, when I think about this from a director's perspective, from a board member's perspective, even the board member's own personal addresses and phone numbers and emails could be considered personally identifiable information and therefore potentially very attractive data to potentially hack. And so, even just thinking about the directors themselves, right? They're sort of analogous to part-time employees who've got access to very highly sensitive information, but might operate outside the company's networks and outside the company's control systems. I mean, I know that's something we talk to our clients a lot about. I'm curious to know, from your perspective, and the question that we got is sort of asked in the same vein, how do you help directors identify all the different possible kinds of data in their company that's potentially at risk? Seems like it could be a big list. So how do they approach that? What should they do?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. Thanks for bringing that up. So I think one of the key things that we point out here is that data and information goes beyond just what you have within the four walls of your organization or your company. And you have a personal responsibility as any employee, from the bottom part-time person all the way up to the board, to do some due diligence and have some responsibility around that data. And it goes, like I said, beyond the organization. It permeates your personal life as well. So you mentioned one of the things about connectivity to other places, like a coffee shop or something like that. We will cover a lot of that information in our next webinar on vulnerabilities. And that really kind of goes to what we call an attack surface, which is all the avenues through which an adversary can utilize to get to you and your organization. So what do you do about data? All data is at risk. I think you have to recognize that. And as directors and senior executives of any organization, what you have to do is go through the process of taking account, doing an audit of that data, but then prioritizing it. You have to do what's called a crown jewel assessment and determine what are the most valuable pieces of data to your organization. You essentially want to recognize your grandmother's wedding ring, right? If you lose your grandma's wedding ring, that is gone forever. That is a crown jewel that you will never get back. If you lose your credit card, on the other hand, that's something you can replace pretty easily, right? So you think about that from a data perspective at your organization, you want to find the equivalent of the wedding rings within your organization, make those your top priority, and do your best to protect those. Does that answer your question, Dowdy?
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. That's super helpful.
No problem at all. Okay, so let me go back here. I think I moved too far ahead. All right, great. So once we accept that we are all, in essence, technology companies, the next thing to do is to recognize that not all data is created equally. Each industry generally has different types of data, and data has differing values to different threat actors. Actually, the top 5 costliest industries per capita are health at $402 per record lost, followed by life science, which is a 301, financial, 264, transportation, 247, and energy at a cost of 246 per record lost. Compare those industries to the total average cost that you see here on the screen of 211 per record loss across all industries. So some real scenarios that we see here are around certain types of data. So personally identifiable information. This is a most commonly targeted piece of information. That's because it's easy to obtain, and it can be used for a large number of things, such as credit card fraud, hacking into other accounts, spearphishing other organizations, etc. Protected health information, on the other hand, it has additional information that enables a broader set of fraudulent activities. This is why you see health, the health industry, at the top of the costliest industries. With that data, adversaries can do a lot more with it. So they can do pharmaceutical fraud, disability claims, etc. So that data is then priced at a premium. And then lastly, you see a lot of information or intellectual property theft. And you see this typically with nation-state actors doing espionage activities, as well as corporate espionage. Think about the impacts to your organization if your most sensitive IP was stolen. All the R&D that you put into it, all the efforts you put in, could be easily taken by another organization or an adversary. So as you think about your organization, think about the industry you're in and the type of data you hold. Ensure that your team develops a cyber strategy around risk, one that takes into account the value of your assets as well as the potential cost to the business should something go wrong. You know, one of the
Jeff,
most...
I'm sorry, this is Dottie chiming in again. We have another question. Is it okay if I give you a question to chew on here? So, so someone sort of sent a little anecdote and then had a question, and I thought it was helpful to share. So, the anecdote that they sent was, just kind of thinking about, how you identify what kind of information in your company might be valuable and therefore sort of a potential target. The story they were sharing might be one that's familiar to many people on the phone that I guess it was maybe last year, sort of late last year, former Secretary Colin Powell had an unfortunate incident. He was director at Salesforce, and he wanted to send an email to his fellow directors about their acquisition targets for the year and accidentally made a mistake in the address of the email that he was about to send, and it went to the editor's desk of the Wall Street Journal. And so that ended up as an article in the Wall Street Journal the following day, and obviously, those acquisition targets were now made public, and that, kind of had an impact on Salesforce's share price, really. And so, I think this question, kind of reminded me of that, and really was asking, how can you help directors sort of protect themselves from themselves? What would be some recommendations that you might have to help them really adequately prepare how they behave and how they communicate and how they operate so that they don't potentially leak important data, not just an outside actor trying to hack it, but how do we help directors not accidentally do something and cause a breach?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it actually goes back to the second thing I wrote on our light board here, which is, at the end of the day, cyber is a people problem. And I think from an education perspective, if you aren't familiar with any topic area, you are at more risk, right? Knowledge is power. So the first thing we recommend is, getting spun up on the issue. Become literate. Know what activities, what behaviors are putting your organization at risk. If you can start changing your behaviors, you can start making a change across your organization. Now, we're all humans, and we all have our own mistakes. Human errors is the #1 reason for all cyber breaches. So we can't just blindly trust that each of us are going to be perfect, because we're not. So you also have to implement really great technological solutions to help you where you can. And there are a variety of different technologies that can help you out with issues like that. You can actually get technology services that track files wherever you send them. And you can also get technology that prevents you from disseminating information beyond a controlled group. And I thought Diligent had something like that in their service offerings too, which is a really great feature.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And we'll,
didn't you have something like that?
We do, yeah. I mean, and towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about, if people are curious to learn a bit more, how they can contact us, and we can, certainly do demos and talk with them about it. But just to give a very brief explanation, there's a couple things. I mean, one is that we have a platform that provides, completely secured and closed-loop communication among a board or, a group of executives, and so they have to have, the specific app, and they have to have credentials in order to communicate with one another. But when they're there, they don't have to worry that they might accidentally send it to the wrong place, because only people who should receive those communications are part of that network. So there's a way to just, kind of mitigate that. Obviously it requires the directors to communicate within that system, but the advantage is then there's no concern that you're sending it to the Wall Street Journal by accident. So there's sort of a good payoff there.
Yeah, it's a really embarrassing situation to send some of your corporate data to a news outlet. But I think we all can relate to that. We've all sent messages to someone that we thought was someone else, whether it's a text message or an email or instant message of some sort. So it happens to all of us. Okay, great. So this slide really is an interesting slide, because what it does is shows that one of the most troubling trends that seems to stay pretty consistent year to year is that the bad guys are regularly outpacing the good guys. So since 2013, cyber attacks have increased by nearly 30% globally. And to illustrate how proficient the adversary is, just take a look at the charts on the slide here. The top bar chart shows that 93% of the time, attackers take less than an hour to compromise the system. 82% of them can get in within minutes. Once they're in a system, they can get your information out within days. In fact, 29% can do it in minutes or less. And then if you look at this bottom chart here, the top line confirms what is illustrated in the bar graphic above, that in all cases it takes days or less to compromise the system. But unfortunately, as indicated by the bottom line, since 2014, there has been a divergent trend to discover attacks in the same amount of time. The bottom graph line indicates that less than 25% of the time, a cyber compromise is detected within days. So these guys are really getting very creative, very efficient, and traditional defenses aren't enough. So who are the bad guys? This is, in fact, a webinar on threats. So there are essentially 5 different categories of cyber threat actors: nation states, cyber criminals, hacktivists, insider threats, and script kiddies. And they're listed here generally by level of sophistication. So nation states are essentially state-sponsored groups. They're military-grade cyber threat actors. They're highly sophisticated and very well-resourced.
Hey, Jeff, this is Dottie. We seem to have lost your audio. Are you still there? So, Jeff, I don't know if you can hear me, but we're not able to hear you. So we will be getting Jeff back on the audio here shortly. Oh, okay, now we can. Yeah, hey, welcome back.
Sorry about that.
So you said you were talking about nation states and about the fact that they are military sponsored, they have big budgets, and then you cut out.
Yeah, so they're the most sophisticated and well-resourced threat group, and it varies a lot depending on the nation. Cyber criminals come in a couple different forms. They can come in as individuals, as groups, and even syndicates that are looking for financial gain or leverage across another organization, blackmail, etc. Hacktivists also will come in the form of individuals and groups, and they are motivated by some sort of ideology, whether that's a religious ideology, a political ideology, etc. Insider threats are kind of a tricky one, right? So these are members of your organization that are intentionally, or most often unintentionally, they cause harm. It's really hard to protect, especially those who are out for malicious intent. And then lastly, script kiddies are at the bottom of the list here, but don't want to rule them out because they still can cause a lot of harm. In general, script kiddies are new or inexperienced hackers who are seeking what we call skills or thrills. So they typically turn into a different type of group, whether that's a cyber criminal group or they move to more political or social causes. It's really important to know the different types of threat actors because understanding of adversarial motivations allow you to better prepare and defend your organization from threats. Knowing their motivations is really important because they will help you understand the potential threats across your portfolio and make determinations on resources, policies, and processes. And as you can see, there are a wide range of goals that motivate threat actors here. And recent attacks demonstrate that those motives are continuing to evolve in ways we had never even thought. Last year alone, there was this huge denial of service attack, shut down major websites because they used the Internet of Things as they weaponized it, essentially. That's really creative. So don't underestimate the people problem. Lastly,
So
it's really
Jeff,
important to understand, yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. Why don't you go ahead and finish your point, but when you're ready, we have a question for you.
Okay, great. So it's important to understand that your data could be more valuable to a particular threat actor than it is to you. This is why we recommend analyzing your data as what's most important through both your eyes as a senior executive as well as through the eyes of each threat actor category, right? We talked about prioritizing your crown jewels and data. You should do that from your perspective as a leader in your organization, but then you should go through the process and saying, hey, if a nation state came after us, what would they most likely want? And by getting both perspectives, you can set yourself up for a more resilient organization. A question?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And you may have actually already sort of answered this in part, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I bet there's probably more that you might want to say there. So the question was about, how should the company parse out what part of identifying these potential risks and potential actors really should be more of management's job versus what is really in the director's job description. And I think that part of the question is fueled by, we did a survey recently and a number of directors sort of said, well, we think management's handling that, quote unquote, handling that. So I think there's just some confusion about what really is the director's role here in identifying these kinds of actors and risks and really what should belong to management.
Yeah, so I think one thing that really stood out to me in your description of the responses from the directors, it was the word think. As a director of an organization, you don't want to think, you want to know. So your job is to actually ask really tough questions of your management. Be proactive about it. Yeah, as you go down through the organization, they're going to have more awareness and fidelities around the type of threats that are happening and what the organization is doing to protect them. But at each level of management should go through this process, understanding what the data is really important, what they think the threat is, all the way down. And then once you combine all those answers, you'll have a better awareness around it. And even just asking the question down the management chain will start to generate some real results.
That's great. And Jeff, you may be about to get there, but there's sort of a follow-up question here, which would be if you, and I think in fact you are about to go here in like the next slide or two, what would be some, potential specific questions that directors should be asking of management? What kinds of data should they be asking for? What kinds of reports should they be requesting, and sort of the frequency of those? That's kind of the next set of questions, but I think you're about to get there.
Yeah, we'll cover those in a slide or two here. But I will answer quickly that there are really great cyber threat reports that are written for directors and senior executives. You should be reading up on those. They can be entertaining to read, and it's really important to know what's going on in the different industries so you can have a better quill of questions to ask and fire away down at your management teams.
And Jeff, just to piggyback on that point, there is one of those reports that we're actually going to be including in the handout. So I'm glad you mentioned that. We'll make sure to send that out to the audience as well.
Great, thanks. Okay, so each category of threat actors have different means and motives for conducting nefarious activities. You can't control what drives them to action or how sophisticated they are. The only thing that you have control over as a director is the opportunity the adversary has to target you. Your goal as the senior business leader is to guide the organization in a way that reduces your vulnerabilities and, as such, the opportunity for the adversary. Keep in mind the threat actors typically want the greatest return for the least amount of efforts. So remember this. You don't have to outrun the bear. You just need to outrun the guy next to you. And that should be the goal of every single organization. If you do get targeted, it happens in one of three different ways. So we're going to start in the middle here with target of opportunity. This is the low-hanging fruit for an adversary. It's the window that was left open, and a thief noticed it as he was walking up and down the street and went into your house. You weren't specifically targeted, but it was there, and it was convenient, and they thought they could get something from breaking into your house. A much scarier scenario, however, is when you are directly targeted. This is what happens when the adversary is essentially hell-bent on compromising your systems and data. A good example of this was back in 2010. Iran's Natanz nuclear facility was targeted by a cyber attack that significantly slowed down uranium enrichment operations in Iran. A lot of resources were dedicated to pull off an effort like that, and it was successful. Lastly, you can become a victim as collateral damage. This is basically being adversely affected from an effort that was directed elsewhere. So going back here, for example, after the nuclear facility was targeted in Iran, the malware used in that effort also affected organizations across the globe, particularly in Indonesia and India. While the impacts weren't the same as it had at that Iranian nuclear facility, they still caused some disruption to business operations globally. So the board's role here. The board needs to find interactions and make certain that the organization is focusing their efforts on protection against the highest risk actors. This can be done by having an open and candid conversation between the board, management, and consultants who can help the organization with these identifications. So let's go through some key questions here. One of the first questions you should be asking is what makes your company an appealing target? As I mentioned earlier, it's really important to conduct a blue hat and a red hat analysis of your organization. You're looking at it from your perspective as well as the adversary perspective. You also want to pay attention to geopolitical events. We often look at the world news as an indicator for financial markets. It's no different with cyber. If something's going on, there's a major conflict elsewhere, know that that can have cyber implications that don't seem related to you. The second question here, what are the key cyber risks in our industry and what are the costs? You have to know the threats and tactics that are common for your industry because it varies across industries. And then you need to run different scenarios to determine what the impacts would be under those different tactics that are used. Third question, what opportunities are we providing threat actors? If you can start to understand how to decrease those opportunities, you can start reducing the likelihood of a successful attack. You should also conduct a data audit to understand what your crown jewels are and how they're exposed. It's really, really important to ensure that your most sensitive data is encrypted at rest and in transit. This way it's protected. You also want to make sure that you have a process to conduct regular backups of your most important information. This has been a big mistake for companies who don't back up their data but become victims of ransomware attacks. Another thing you should do is that lifecycle management point that I made earlier in the webinar. You want to purge information that you don't need. You're not vulnerable with data that you don't have. And then lastly, you want to conduct what's called a penetration test of your networks, as well as what's called an exfiltration analysis. The attacker never comes in, or rarely comes in, and uses the same route to get back out of your organization. They come in one way, and they move data out a different way. So you want to look at your organization to see how they can come in and how they can get data out. Another question that you should be asking are what types of threat actors have the greatest means of targeting your invested companies? By assessing who possesses the greatest risk, you can then prioritize your assets and security efforts based on those findings. And you really want to reach out to your local law enforcement, FBI branch, and make a connection with them. You also want to know, you want to ask if you're sharing information with your industry peers. You should encourage your organization to participate in what's called an ISAC or an ISO. That's an Information Sharing Analysis Center or an Information Sharing Analysis Organization. According to the Ponemon Institute, if you participate in information sharing efforts, that will reduce the cost of a breach by average of $7.50 per record lost. So when we go back to that average cost of data per record loss was $221, you can start chipping away at that through some really great policies. And then lastly, which organizations within our industry have been targeted by a cyber attack, and how did it happen? Use every single incident as a learning opportunity. Dottie, do you have anything you want to cover here on the software side?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and then we also have another question that's come in. So, but first, just to talk a little bit about, just thinking about directors communicating information, receiving materials for board meetings, speaking with one another, just thinking about that kind of director communication as one potential area of data that is, risky and potentially vulnerable. If you're thinking about what kinds of software you might use to help with that, there are specific requirements that you want to ensure on the software selection process. So first of all, you want to make sure that whatever software you're using to communicate that kind of sensitive information has no reliance on third-party plugins or browser add-ins or anything that could introduce a security vulnerability outside of the core system. The reason being, the core system is hopefully being backed up and managed by the company that you work with, and they're sort of giving you their assurances that they do that appropriately. But if they're using third-party plugins, they may not have a lot of control over the way the third party manages that software. And so you want to make sure that that's not introducing any sort of vulnerabilities into the process that is outside of the control. You also want to make sure, just as Jeff mentioned a moment ago, that especially customer data is fully encrypted both while it's being transmitted, so potentially through something like TLS, as well as while it's at rest on servers, so potentially through encryption such as AES 256. So you want to make sure that everything is being managed appropriately, and so that kind of at no point in the process could that data be hackable because of unencryption or unencrypted data just languishing out there. Whether it's in a data center, whether it's being managed by your internal team, whether it's being hosted in the cloud, the encrypted data is really incredibly important, and you want to make sure that it's never stored or transmitted in conjunction with the encryption key. Those two things should absolutely be completely separated, firewalled off, and managed independently, so there's no risk invited there. And then finally, you want to make sure that every server, client, data store component in the system is securely isolated. So that isolation becomes incredibly important because then there's really no way for those things to be combined by potential threat actors and used to access the data. So just making sure that the individual components are stored separately, completely independent from one another, that's a good control mechanism. And so I would potentially say these might add to some of the kinds of questions that directors would ask. As you're thinking about the kinds of systems you might use to communicate sensitive data, do they meet these requirements? Have they actually met this benchmark? Jeff, anything that you want to add to that as well?
No, that's right on point.
So the question that came in that I think would be really helpful to get your thoughts about, and this is actually a question I sort of had for myself, and then someone asked something similar, and so I'm going to kind of combine them. If I'm a director listening to this webinar right now, I'm probably thinking about what is this going to cost us? How much time should we invest in training and in software and in investigation of potential risk, and really what should we think about as a company investing in cybersecurity? And if I'm thinking about that from the director level, I'm also thinking about what should we as a board invest in training and education and ongoing monitoring of potential areas of risk, knowing that these are enterprise risks and knowing that people are often the most vulnerable point of the system. How should we think about resourcing this?
Yeah, so a great question. The second number I wrote on our light board here was 56%, right? So that number indicated the percentage of boards that felt like they weren't getting enough director education. So I posit, based on what we do at CyberVista, but also what the data is showing from NACD, is that you need to be proactive about education and literacy. One of the big problems that we're seeing across the markets is that cyber awareness training is really important, it has great benefits, but oftentimes senior executives and directors are excluded, or they don't have to participate in regular awareness training. And I would posit too that directors and executives and even functional managers need a different type of cyber awareness program. So I was air quoting over here. You couldn't see cyber awareness, but it was air quoted. Your job is to manage and oversee or govern risks. So you need a program that's focused on that in addition to the regular hygiene and behavioral awareness stuff. And as far as technology goes, one of the things that we cover in our program, in our second unit, monitor unit, where we're measuring effectiveness across people, process, technology, and environment, is that one of the things that we say is that you really want to look for, when it comes to technology, a 20% investment that yields an 80% return. There's a lot of solutions out there that are redundant. So you want to do a really good job in making sure that the systems that you're putting in place don't have the same features as another system. You're just not utilizing them right. So you want to be really smart about how you invest your money. But remember, at the end of the day, it always comes back to people. So you want to be literate. You want to make sure that the information that you're passing back and forth as directors is really secure, and prioritize those issues.
Jeff, thanks. That's super helpful. And we do have another question that I think is a little bit more specific, but I'd like to ask it because I think there's probably a lot of people that would like to hear your response to this. This question is more about how directors can protect themselves, and in particular from something like a well-organized spear phishing attack. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so the DNC hack, if you think back on that, there was a lot of criticism there because Podesta opened his email, and that, I think that the point of that, and in so many other situations, is that it's very difficult to recognize and identify a malicious email. So there are things that you can do. There are certainly technology solutions that will help filter that out. I'm sure your organizations are already participating in spam filtering and some sort of spear phishing identification. But you should look at every single correspondence email with a critical eye. There are some basic things that you can do by looking at the email headers, by checking out where the link's going to go to before you actually click on it. So you should take some of those practices and apply to your everyday, so that you don't just click on an email click on a link and it takes you to some sort of malicious website, or just download a file that's corrupted and armed with malicious code.
Yeah, that's great. And Jeff, if you don't mind, I'm gonna piggyback on that by just putting in a plug for, look, this is a really good reason to think about, especially if you're talking about communicating with other directors about company-related business or with executives related to company-related business. It's a really good reason to have a closed-loop communication system that is unique just to that company. So something like Diligent Messenger, which is set up especially and specifically for that reason, so that all the communication is completely controlled and secured and encrypted, and is not really going to be subject to a spear phishing attack. There's no sort of external entry point. So I think look, that doesn't protect you against every kind of email communication you might have, but if you're talking about company business and you're talking with other directors and executives, it might be worthwhile to invest in a system that is specific just to that universe, so that you're not subject to those kinds of attacks.
Yeah, that's great. And I would also say on top of that, the closed loop systems are really great, but you should also be up to date on the most recent threats and trends. You should do some sort of annual training around cyber.
That's great. Yeah, no, I totally want to agree with that. And so, Jeff, I think we're kind of coming up to the end here. I think we've gone through the questions that we received, because a couple of the questions I sort of combined into one, so I think we've covered most of the questions. Let's talk about where we go from here. I know we've got a couple of next steps we'd like to suggest to people, and then we hope that this crowd has been interested enough in what we've talked about today that they'll be willing to join us for part 2. So why don't we talk a little bit about some of the next steps?
Yeah, great. Yeah, so where do we go from here, right? When it comes to cybersecurity, everyone has a responsibility. I think you've heard us beat that drum here over this last hour. The first step to success is literacy. Our Cyber Resolve programs allow for a structured approach to cyber risk management. We cover 25 cyber-related topic areas, and we also offer a cyber breach simulation exercise so that you can put your skill sets to the test. Understanding how you perform in a simulated exercise will give you great insight, great insights into how your team performs. On May 1st, we're hosting a day-long seminar in New York City at the Times Square, Weston. You can join us there by using the promo code Diligent. We'll give you $500 off your registration fee. It's a full program. It'll cover the prepare, monitor, and react sections of our program, and we'll also have that simulation. But we can also go to you. We bring the learning to you and your organization through customizable private training. If you're seeking more intimate and bespoke experience, please contact me for more information. I'm happy to talk to you about our private sessions. Yeah, and I guess, if you're not already a Diligent customer, please consider them, as they have the best board collaborations software out there. So, Dottie, I'll let you close it out.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. Yeah, and just on that final point, I want to make sure to just remind everybody that we will be sending some follow-up information after this webinar. A couple things will be happening. As soon as we end the session, you'll be seeing information to fill in a survey. So there'll be a quick little survey about this webinar. Because we have 2 more of these that we're going to be presenting, we'd really love to hear from you on this first one. Give us your candid feedback. Tell us how we can make the next 2 sessions meaningful for you. And then in addition to that, Jeff has given a lot of really great suggestions, particularly this wonderful program that they've got coming up on May 1st. Really easy, simple way for you to get educated quickly on a bunch of very important issues. We'd also love to speak with you, particularly for those of you on the phone who are already diligent customers who maybe aren't already using our Messenger platform, which I've been mentioning a couple of times. I think it's certainly very helpful in this context. And of course, the rest of our suite of products focused on secure communication. So we'd love to hear from you. And then finally, just a reminder that we will be sending out the handouts from today because the download didn't work so great. So just keep an eye out for the email from us. We'll be sending out the handouts. And then we'd love to hear from you next time. I want to just take a moment and thank you so much, my colleague, Jeff Welgan, Head of Executive Training Programs at CyberVista, for this fantastic presentation. Jeff, thank you so much for your time today. I think this was really great, and hopefully the people that have joined us will think so too and give us their feedback.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me, and I look forward to next week's presentation on vulnerabilities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And let me also just give one quick thank you to my other two colleagues who've been silently helping here on today's webinar. And we've got Danielle Nathanson and we also have Kat Malone, who have been here just kind of helping us, making sure everything goes well. And so thank you to both of you. And then most especially, thank you to our audience. Thanks for joining us today. We had really good attendance today. Clearly, we've struck a nerve. This is an important topic. I think everybody's really trying to become smarter on this topic and figure out what they need to do and how to do it cost effectively and efficiently. And so we really want to help you with that. So look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again for your time, and have a really great week, everybody. We'll be back on the line for part 2, just coming up soon on same time next week. Same day, same time next week. So thanks again, and have a great day.